We're live.
Okay, everybody. Hi, I am Rachel Rollins. I am the District Attorney of Suffolk County. We have a full agenda for you guys tonight for our town hall. Just to sort of give you the roadmap, I'm going to speak for maybe 7 to 10 minutes just to sort of lay the groundwork about what you're going to hear this evening. You are then going to hear from the Chief of our Crime Strategies Bureau, Luke Goldworm, about some data trends that we're seeing throughout Suffolk County. And next, we are going to have a wonderful panel of experts in Karu Pitch, in Ian Pollenbaum, and in Katia Santiago Taylor, we're going to have a panel discussion about some issues that are disparately impacting women. So we will get started, and then we are hopeful, or we aren't hopeful, we will be timely so that you can get out of here by 7. So first and foremost, we want to thank you for joining the town hall. It's the first one we've had of 2020. When I became district attorney on January 2nd, 2019, I was inaugurated. I promised that I was going to hold quarterly town halls that would allow Suffolk County residents to not only hear directly from me about the great work that our office is doing, but to have an opportunity for us to hear from the community. So that they can express their concerns, ask us questions, and we were available. Prior to the pandemic, we held these town halls in our various neighborhoods in person. In 2019, we went to Roxbury in March, Chelsea in June, Winthrop in September, and Mattapan in December. However, since the pandemic started, we've been able to reach the entire community through virtual platforms, while diving deeper on topics that are relevant to the safety of our communities. So in 2019, it was more geographic that we were focusing on. In 2020, we had 3 topical sort of town halls and 4 DA lives, because even though I'm old, we are trying to adapt to the media and have instances where we can communicate with you guys in real time. So in 2020, in March, we had a virtual town hall with Brighton Alston and their community. In between May and August, we had 4 district attorney lives to discuss community violence, including one with a focus on the Americans with Disabilities in July, that act in July. In September, we discussed collateral consequences of COVID. And in December, we chose to have a election pulse check-in for just for the community. For this meeting, in recognition of Women's History Month, we'll be having a candid conversation about issues that disproportionately affect women. So the year thus far, before we talk about Suffolk County public safety issues in depth, it's important that we address the events of the last 3 months and what we can look forward to in the year ahead. As we all know, on January 6th, there was an insurrection that's a mob, quite frankly, that stormed our nation's capital in order to undermine our democratic process. I know there are people that are tired of me saying that many things have to do with race, but I think it is really obvious when we watched who the overwhelming majority of the people were that stormed our capital, that law enforcement is clearly capable of showing restraint, even in the face of violence, threats, and a mob mentality with certain communities. I will reiterate that there are other communities where we peacefully protest and are met with violence by the very police departments that our taxes pay for. It is troubling and distressing. And I know there's somebody on here who is not in agreement with what it is that I'm saying. So it has never been about law and order for these communities. It's about protecting those the law was intended to benefit and keeping order in a euphemism for suppression of voices, of certain voices that have not historically been heard by this community or by our government. So these biases are affecting our communities in very direct ways, particularly as we push through and recover from the pandemic. As I've said before, and we have seen, unless your head is in the sand, that racism and poverty are comorbidity factors when it comes to COVID-19. Communities such as Revere, Chelsea, and Roxbury have been particularly affected by the most deadly consequences of the virus. And yet, these are the very communities that have faced the most significant obstacles in assessing life-saving vaccine doses. As the Boston Globe recently reported, vaccination rates in Massachusetts are lagging in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, most notably among our Latino our Latinx population and brothers and sisters. Approximately 8% of the Latinx population in Massachusetts, 15% of Black residents, and 13% of Asian residents have received at least one dose of the vaccine, compared to 22% of white residents. We need to be clear. We are not saying that we don't believe white residents should be getting the vaccine. We just want to make sure that it is distributed in an equitable way, and that you don't have to be wealthy and entitled and privileged to actually get a slot to get the vaccine. So, you know, I think Senator Sonia Chang Diaz said this beautifully. If you have internet access, if you have a computer, if you have 3 to 4 hours to sit around and wait on a website that is faulty at best, if you have the ability to drive to a large location that might not be near where you are, these are significant barriers that individuals have. And what we've seen in this global pandemic is we've always known our first responders were police officers and fire and emergency and EMS workers. But we now know that there are also people that work in hospitals and supermarkets. Those are the ones that kept us alive, food distribution centers, when we were all sheltering in place in March of 2020. So I really do believe that although those disparities, and we have unfortunately seen an uptick in Asian communities across the country of systemic racism and harm regarding hate-based incidents, where we have seen, even the highest ranking members of our government previously making racially insensitive and inaccurate statements about people in this global pandemic. So I feel like we have to do better, but there are reasons why we should be hopeful. So we just passed the American Rescue Plan providing relief to American families. The House just passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021, which marks an important step towards addressing systemic racism and abuses as a country while striving to build better trust in our criminal legal system and helping acknowledge our nation's painful origins and history of targeted harm and oppression. Furthermore, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act can ensure that our democracy reflects the voices of all people occupying space and justifiably and righteously occupying space in the United States of America. We are also doing our part to make sure our community is safe here in Suffolk County. We have really been leading the charge. We had one of the first grand juries set up in our state after the pandemic hit, and one of the first in the country. Just so you guys understand, many of they're called Part 1 crimes. Luke can explain this later, but our most violent and serious crimes are the Superior Court is what they call that here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The next thing that we did, which is awesome, is that we have a JAR program, a Juvenile Alternative Resolution Program, that focuses on our younger individuals that unfortunately come into contact with the criminal legal system. We worked with the City of Boston and Lesley University to make sure that those individuals, many of whom are in the Department of Children and Families Care or the Department of DYS custody, we've seen disparities with respect to our schooling when everything went remote. And, you know, if you have a parent or a guardian that works full time or all the time and you are responsible for, you know, I'm the oldest of 5 children. If I was responsible for watching my siblings, there were, or I lived in a community where the internet access is not as strong, Wi-Fi is not as available, or, you know, I want to turn my screen off because I don't want the rest of the people that I go to school with to see that I'm home watching my siblings or look into my home, depending on where I live or what my living situation is. We have to be able to adapt, and I think our JAR program has done a great job there. And then we have, last but not least, we've really worked at inclusion and diversity and equity in our program. So we have a fellowship program for law students to join our office. And we also created a scholarship in honor of Paul Mclaughlin. Paul was a prosecutor that had originally been in the Attorney General's office and was working in the DA's office. He lived in West Roxbury, and he was murdered. He was executed by a defendant that he had been intended to prosecute. And we honor Paul every single year in this office. I obviously was not the DA when that started, but it was my honor to continue the legacy of Paul Mclaughlin, as Ralph Martin, the district attorney, did, as Dan Conley, the district attorney, did, and as now I have as well. So we are looking at giving some scholarships away where we will be helping young people when they go off to college with not only financial assistance, but also wraparound services, mentors, etc. So with respect to that, I'm going to sort of transition, is that I want to explain that the sort of stressors and trauma that are a combined recipe for disaster that have come with respect to COVID. So many of our Suffolk County communities, remember that's Boston, Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere, where violence has surged since the start of the pandemic, are home to what we talked about earlier, the very people who have been keeping us all fed, clean, and safe through the height of the pandemic and continue to do so as we start the slow return to normal. These are supermarket employees, sanitation workers, food service and food processing staff, hospital employees and caregivers. They have no choice but to work because they don't have the luxury of telecommuting or zooming into their jobs. And many also don't have paid sick leave or hazard pay. These essential and often invisible workers are barely provided a minimum wage in some of their jobs. These epic societal failures make the violence in these communities even more, traumatic and devastating. And this is a necessary context when we consider the numbers that our next presenter is going to be giving to us and sharing with us. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Luke Goldworm, who is the chief of our Crime Strategies Bureau, as we have Luke start getting ready to speak. When I became DA, we decided to move together the juvenile unit, the narcotics unit, the human trafficking unit, and the youth violence task force. They call it the gang unit. And all 4 of those units are ones where many of the same individuals might be cycling through the system or engaging in harm or experiencing trauma, depending on whether you are a victim of somebody that is being looked at by this unit. Luke used to be an ADA in the office. He left and went to the private sector. We lured him back, and now he is with a data and evidence-based, eye, looking at how we can proactively try to disrupt violence and see trends to see if we can figure out where it's going to happen or how it's going to happen. So I will happily mute myself and turn it over to Luke, who's going to show us some data and charts, and I might jump in, but if we have questions, you can put it in the Q&A and we can discuss that. Thank you. Go ahead, Luke.
Thank you very much, District Attorney Rollins. So as you mentioned, the Crime Strategies Bureau as a concept is to take those 4 units and have them really work together because there's so much overlap and so much synergy between the types of work those 4 teams are doing. and have them be informed by using data intelligence to inform the decisions they make on an everyday basis, so that it's not just a piece of paper in front of someone. We're dealing with humans and we're dealing with people, and to understand the whole picture, you need all that information. So whether we use that information to improve public safety through diversion or through prosecution, that information ultimately guides where we go. And one of the steps we've done in that process is to divide those teams into geographic teams. So Suffolk County is divided in crime strategies into 5 teams by location, and each of those teams has a prosecutor, at least one prosecutor for narcotics, gang, juvenile, and human trafficking, as well as an analyst assigned to it. And as a result, the idea is that they are more attuned to the community through their connections with community-based organizations, their law enforcement partners in the community, and as a result, they are addressing the needs of that particular community or neighborhood much more adeptly than catching as catch can on a sort of broader basis. And so this year and in the years prior, we've been able to use that information to both inform our decision-making dispositionally when we come to the end of a case, or if we are considering pretrial detainment in some manner, whether it's appropriate, we can look at that correlation between different units on cases, or as a trend we begin to see pop up, whether we can begin to put resources in place with our police partners and our community-based organizations to address that problem head on rather than waiting till it gets explosive or ramps up. And we've done that with a series of juvenile robberies. We've done that in cases of our shooting strategy last summer, as well as with some of our human trafficking initiatives, where we've seen this correlation between drug activity and human trafficking activity. And ultimately, as well, to provide information to our community partners so that they can better do their jobs by understanding how the people and the services that they provide interact with the criminal justice system and with the overall process. One of the main data points we look at, one of the primary indicators for public safety as we look overall in the community, is our first sort of data point, which is fatal and non-fatal shootings in Suffolk County. Thank you very much. And so as we look year over year, in the first 2 months in the early part of March, we have a 13.6% increase in the amount of shootings so far this year. 4 of those this year, unfortunately, have been fatal shootings. As compared to last year, we had 8 fatal shootings by this point. 49 fatal shootings overall last year. Those shootings were heavily in the Dorchester and Roxbury neighborhoods, particularly in the Grove Hall section of Roxbury, where we've seen an escalation of gun violence as of recent. As was alluded to by District Attorney Rollins, the lack of social emotional services being provided based on the pandemic and some of the restrictions on normal apparatus that support our communities not being in place, homeschooling and other things have led to increased trauma and conditions back in certain neighborhoods. And as a result, we see this escalation of gun violence as of late. And so we have seen an increase year over year in this early part of the year. As we also look at the sort of average suspect and victim age, they remain pretty constant in the early or the young 20s. It is a younger group of individuals comparatively some of our other major violent crime categories. If we can go to the next slide, please. As we look at fatal and non-fatal stabbings, this is an area that is of increased concern to us and part of our planning in terms of where we see the heat map. You can see the heat map, particularly in the area around Mass and Cass, Melanita, Cass, and Massachusetts Ave. There was a 69% increase in stabbing incidents so far this year. 3 of those, unfortunately, were fatal in nature. We only had 1 last year in the same period, and 6 for the year. This tends to be an older group of both victims and suspects, and you see it in that community amongst those challenged with mental health concerns and drug addiction, particularly in that area. in the mid to late 30s as an average age. And so we see both in Dorchester in some regards, but mostly in that South End area. We've also seen a number of incidents cropping up in Revere as well in regards to non-fatal and fatal stabbings this year. And one of the last major indicators is firearm arrest. You can go to the next slide. So as we look year over year, there's been a 34% increase in firearm arrests made this year. Our partners in major police departments, particularly so here in Boston, continue to make arrests, leading to the recovery of significant seizures of firearms. Most concerning to us is the trend we see in the legality of the weapons being seized. We're seeing an increase in the amount of polymer, 80% are ghost guns, essentially guns that are manufactured outside their traditional channels of firearm vendors and manufacturers. These are referred to as 80% firearms because they are 80% of the firearm itself can be bought through legal means. It's that last 20%, the lower receiver, which is manufactured and added to the firearm to make it fully functional, that is created outside of the process. It makes these guns harder to stop and interdict but prior to getting in the hands of people in the community. We're also seeing firearms with larger capacity magazines, 50 round drums, in some cases semi-automatic switches automatic switches placed on firearms, and machine guns recovered by the Boston Police Department. Adding to that, we are seeing an uptick in robberies as of recent, and the amount of firearms used to facilitate those robberies have increased. We've seen half the number of firearms used to facilitate those robberies this year alone as in all of last year, indicating that there seems to be a presence of more firearms on the street. The good news is Boston Police and our partners are working with us to get more of them off the street, but there is this increased number. We're seeing 9mm Smith & Wesson and Taurus be the most common firearms taken off the street, and we're seeing most of that activity in Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury, and again, with particularity to the Roxbury Grove Hall section, as you can see by the heat map here. As these trends evolve year over year, some of them tend to balance out. Based on last year, we had a spike a little later in the year, a little earlier, but it is early in the year, and we are keeping our eye on where those various spikes are, and working with those law enforcement and community partners to actively identify those individuals driving the violence, driving the crime, and work on that from an enforcement point of view, and those that are caught up through mental health, addiction, and as sort of in the community that needs services, and identifying and making sure those services are in place by using this information as part of our overall strategy. Last, given our topic this evening, I wanted to give a little insight into violence against women from the traditional lens of these, as the DA said, Part 1 crimes, which are homicide, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, and taking them in the two main categories that we just talked about, which are shootings and stabbings. In 2021, there have been 25 shooting victims. 22 were male and 3 were female. Females or women accounted for 12% of that victim population, and unfortunately 2 of those victims were victims of homicide. Looking back to last year, there were a total of 293 shooting victims in all of 2020. 269 of those victims were male and 24 were female. 8% of the population affected by these traditional metrics for violent crime. And again, the panel that will follow will get more into domestic violence, sexual assault. In these instances, In 2020, there were 2 victims of shootings that were victims of homicide. And then as we look at stabbings year over year, again, there were 28 stabbing victims in the year 2021. So far, 25 of those victims were male, 3 of them were female, and so far, none of those victims were female victims were victims of homicide. And looking back last year, 155 stabbing victims in 2020, 139 were male, 16 female, were 10% of the population in terms of, or the victim group was female, and none of them were homicides as well. Looking more towards, as we can see it again, the panel following will more deftly speak to why the firearm violence tends to track female victimology more than on the stabbing end of the spectrum here. But that is sort of the trends as we see them in the violence affecting women on these traditional metrics of shooting and stabbing. District Attorney Rollins, I don't know if you have any specific questions or points.
There was a question regarding, if you don't mind, Luke, explaining A, what a ghost gun is, and then B, why they are so troubling, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So under both state and federal law that dates back some time, what makes a firearm itself illegal is what's called the lower receiver. If you think about looking at a firearm, basically the lower part of it where the trigger pull is, that mechanism in the firearm is what constitutes making a working firearm illegal to have and possess without proper licensing. And so the parts for a firearm can be bought fairly widely across various parts of the country and without restriction. A completed firearm, a working firearm, is restricted based solely on that lower mechanism. So if basically you're buying the parts minus the lower receiver, you're able to purchase all the relevant parts for a firearm and then take what is the lower receiver, what's called an unfinished part of the lower receiver, and finish it and then put the gun together. It's referred to as a ghost gun because the gun itself doesn't exist in the system. It was never logged or cataloged by the ATF. It was never put through gun registration. No manufacturer has it on the books because it was essentially created with a Dremel and a drill press in someone's workshop by taking that lower receiver and making it functioning, basically hammering out the final mechanism parts of it and putting the gun together. And so it is often referred to as an 80% gun, which is sort of a better way to think of it. You're able to buy 80% of the parts from other places and then buy an unfinished 20% of it and finish it off, and thus have a gun that goes around the traditional mechanisms for either purchasing a firearm or getting it through an illegal market. The net result is that firearms end up being cheaper illegally to buy when there's more of them flooding the market and they're easier to get your hands on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's important for people to understand is the legislature decides whether or not, is looking into whether they're going to change anyone's Second Amendment right to bear arms. 99.9% of the cases we are dealing with where there's criminality, it is not a person with a license to carry that is engaging in that behavior, right? When Luke is making firearms arrests, it's not me with my FID card or, a license to carry that I can pull out and show that this is a registered lawful firearm that I am carrying. It's an individual that does not have any license to do so, one. Two, has obliterated the serial number and done any other number of things that would be, escalator clauses with respect to what we can charge them with. I think the frustration that a lot of people who have a license to carry is that people conflate those two groups, right? Of individuals without license, creating most of the harm in our communities, and then lawful gun owners that, we keep making things stricter and stricter. Whether we agree to disagree about high-powered assault rifles or ghost guns and the ability to buy things that aren't regulated. You know, to Luke's point, there aren't serial numbers sort of on these ghost guns that you're putting together. We can't see who has them and who doesn't. So there are some concerns there, but I don't have the ability as the DA to, you know, change people's, it's the Boston Police Department that gives you your license to carry per se and does all of that background check. And depending on what city or town you live in, it could be your chief of police. There are different requirements to do it there. So I know there are some people that had some questions about firearms in the chat. Were there any other things that we, Luke, you want to chat about regarding, you know, any of the crime trends or, you know, anything else that we're seeing before we turn to maybe opening it up to the panel?
No, I think we've covered. I'm happy to answer questions either subsequently or later on about if anyone wants to drill into. I saw some questions relating to human trafficking and drug activity and the nexus. And, you know, I think it's important at least to say before, and then we move on to, and I can answer questions, that we view those exploited by sex traffickers, those who are engaged in sex work as victims of the exploitation. And that's a little bit of a different take than other places around the country, where there are, especially in the adult community, victims of sexual trafficking and exploitation that are charged by DA's offices as sex workers. We don't do that here in Suffolk County. We don't believe that those being trafficked or victimized by traffickers should be criminally penalized as a result of that being exploited. And so we approach all those with that sort of outlook, to look at survivors as what they are, people who are surviving this exploitation and people we need to support and put our arms around, and not as defendants in crimes that we're prosecuting.
Okay, so that's helpful, Luke. I appreciate that. What we're going to do now is turn to an opportunity to hear from some experts in this area regarding some of what they trends they're seeing and maybe answering some of the questions that I have there. So before we get to the panel, though, I do want to give some shout outs. We are proud to have a really diverse senior leadership team in Suffolk County that bring a depth of professional and lived experiences to their positions. My chief of staff is the first Asian woman to ever hold her position in the history of Suffolk County, which started in 1806. My general counsel and the chief of our gang unit are the first women to ever serve in either of their respective positions in our office. One of our assistant district attorneys in the homicide unit, Tara Bergman, was recently named